right, my friends, let's settle down and listen to some history. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and this is episode 1 of a 6-part series I'm calling The History of America in 6 Cars. Very excited to talk about automobiles with you. The rest of this series will be up for our Patreon subscribers. The link is in the episode description, and I will be releasing these episodes over the course of the next few weeks. Very excited to dive deep into the history of cars with you. It's a subject that I've been thinking about for a long time, but I think the last year in which we witnessed the UAW strike, the fact that President Joe Biden went and stood on the line with striking auto workers, whatever you think about that, that was a historic moment, and it made me think that there is a larger story going on here. And what I mean by that is a sort of the automakers' connection to American capitalism is an important one, and one that is in flux right now. And I think it's important to sort of frame that within the larger discussion about electric cars, access to the resources like lithium that are necessary to make electric cars, and the sort of shifting dynamics of global capitalism. Cars have always been a big part of that. I say always, I mean since they became the object of the 20th century after the invention of car number 1, give it away, the Ford Model T, which was first released in 1908. Let's get to that history, because that history sort of connects directly to the world of Elon Musk, Tesla, Joe Biden going to join the striking auto workers. It's all sort of, in my eyes, one big story. And there's also, the connections between, automakers and Nazism that are worth discussing as well. So let's get into this. I think many of you already know and have some notion, it's not a new idea, that the history of America and the history of the world, particularly in the last several centuries, can be told in some ways through the history of transportation technology. So when the North America is first settled by European colonizers, they're on boats, right? And the boat, as a technology of transportation of people and goods, is only going to increase as more and more Europeans come onto the North American continent. So that all of that results in something we call the Canal Age. It's sort of like the late 18th and early 19th century are the years in which there are canals being built all across North America, and they're the central sort of shipping veins. They're the places where people are settling, and canals are artificial projects built by men who gathered capital and really created what are the first type of like corporate arrangements. So the beginnings of corporate capitalism are located during this era, in which you have men of immense power and wealth sort of pooling their resources to create shipping lanes, essentially, in order to transport people and goods and increase their wealth even more. So the Canal Age is an important part of American history, and obviously leads right into the Railroad Age, which is, I think, even more profound in terms of the way it shifts reality and time, and completes the sort of East-West nature of the Manifest Destiny story and the conquering of the continent. So the railroads are obviously like a whole other podcast series. But there are a couple things that I want to get out about the history of railroads that are important and that are going to be important for us moving forward. First of all, I just mentioned the first thing that's important about railroads in the 19th century is that they literally rearranged reality. They bent space and time. They shrank the amount of time it took to get between places, and this resulted in the railroads having to develop the time zone system in order to manage the movement of people and property across these vast distances. So all of a sudden we have, Western time or Pacific time, and Eastern time and Mountain time and Central time. Those are developed by the railroads in the 19th century entirely to help manage the reality of people being able to move between spaces and move goods between spaces in a quicker way. So the second important thing you got to know about railroads is that railroads are responsible for the formation of legal structures in the United States that really created the modern corporation. So there are lots of books about that. The one that I read in graduate school was, I think, by an author called Alfred Chandler, The Visible Hand, which was a really, really detailed look at how railroads developed systems of accountants and managers and hierarchies and bureaucracy that really became the standard structure of American corporations in all industries. So thank you, railroads, for developing this sort of vast network of bureaucrats and administrators and really set the model for what the future was going to be. Even more importantly than that, though, railroads as corporations are sort of creating the model of state capitalism, really becoming so powerful that they are rivaling the state and using and manipulating the state's laws in order to benefit and create maximum benefit for them, which means really creating wealth, but shielding themselves from liability as well. So here's a little bit from a great book by John Sedgwick, which is incidentally called From the River to the Sea, The Untold Story of the Railroad War That Made the West. And some of you may be thinking, wait a second, from the river to the sea, isn't that the phrase that activists use that are pro-Palestine? Isn't that the phrase that we're supposed to be afraid of at Columbia University, etc.? Actually, this phrase is here, obviously associated with American manifest destiny and American colonization and imperialism rather than any other kind of imperialism, but that phrase is interesting that it's used there. In either case, in Sedgwick's excellent book, he lays out sort of what the corporations that were creating railroads were actually doing and becoming in the 19th century, and he says the following. In the 19th century, the American citizenry was introduced to a much more insidious form of corruption, a creation of friendships between powerful trainmen and powerful government officials based on a sense of shared enterprise that redounded to their mutual financial benefit regardless of the public interest. That, in turn, revealed something important about railroads as they scaled up to go national. They were becoming nations themselves, with their own economies, customs, laws, and governments. All too often, they engaged with America as sovereign equals, with potentially calamitous results. So this notion, that is the end of the quote from Sedgwick, by the way, this notion of railroad corporations as becoming nations unto themselves is a thought that I want to sort of hold in our mind as we move forward into the 20th century, thinking about automaking and the production of automobiles and how these corporations become sort of beasts of self-interest that that sort of come on as offering some important good to the public. And that balance between the sort of releasing the desires of the public through providing transportation, in this case on railroads, but also in cars, while also sort of solidifying their own wealth and power. The sort of conflict between those two things, I think, is going to be a significant part of what we're considering here moving forward. The third most important thing about railroads, I think, in the 19th century is that they are owned by big men amassing great wealth and power against labor. And that conflict between the sort of big charismatic leaders and the reality of the labor forces that are often struggling in tension with them is something that is also going to find itself present in the 20th century through figures like Henry Ford and others that we're going to meet throughout this series that sort of fit a common mold. That I mentioned, okay, Elon Musk is a Nazi automaker, Henry Ford is a Nazi automaker. Yeah, that's sort of where I'm going with all of this. But part of it is I think considering these, quote unquote leadership qualities, what they actually mean in terms of that connection to, that balance between being like ultra capitalists, and sort of magicians of desire at the same time. So let's think about that in the context of our first vehicle. It shouldn't be surprising that the first car we're going to talk about is the Ford Model T. So where does this thing come from? In autumn of 1908, Henry Ford began building the Model T in a small warehouse just north of downtown Detroit on Piquette Street. You can still go there. There's a little plaque on the side of the building that lets you know that in autumn of 1908, Ford began building the Model T within that building. So what is it about the Model T that's so important? There are a few things right off the bat. First of all, the Model T was radically different than any other automobile that was on the road at the time, and Ford had to fight his own company to get it built. The Model T was a simple, cheap, practical, affordable car, and that's what made it different. The other thing that made it different is that it was able to go places where other cars weren't able to go because it was powerful and lightweight. What Ford said in 1908 is that I will build a motor car for the great multitude. No man making a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces. Henry Ford's favorite joke was about the farmer who wanted to be buried in his Model T because it had gotten him out of every hole he had ever been in. Initially, the Model T cost $850 compared to upwards of more than $1,000 for comparable vehicles, and by 1924, a Model T cost just $260. That's thanks to a couple of developments in production, specifically the assembly line and mass production, along with the $5 day offered to laborers. We're going to get to why those things are important in a second, but I want to sort of lay out right here at the outset that the Model T became the sort of people's car. By the mid-1920s, it would have been known as the farmer's car, the car that liberated the rural peasantry and allowed them to drive places that they'd never been before. And Henry Ford would have been seen as the person that made all of that happen. One historian put it in biblical terms, and we're going to hear this biblical, mythological stuff a lot with these guys. But here's one historian saying, "Yea, Henry Ford begat the Model T, which begat mass production, which begat the $5 day. And verily those begat the middle class, the suburbs, shopping malls, McDonald's, Taco Bell, drive-through banking, and other things beloved of the modern day Philistines." So I hear a little bit of elitism in that quote, that the car actually created a shithole America of roadside strip malls and idiots stuck in traffic, spending all of their lives stuck in these little vehicles. Yeah, that's a pretty dark view. And, when I'm stuck in traffic, I think I can feel that way as well. But I think we have to get to the other element of this as well, which is the sort of liberatory or even erotic elements of that experience. And that's what Henry Ford is going to understand, I think, almost on a subconscious level. He's not going to get it completely, and we're going to see the limits of Henry Ford's vision in a moment here. But for now, Ford has the vision that farmers would buy a cheap car that could drive them to town, and he's going to be right about that. John Steinbeck later said that most of the babies of the period were conceived in Model T Fords, and not a few were born in them. The theory of the Anglo-Saxon home became so warped that it never quite recovered. That I think that that vision can be extended beyond Anglo-Saxons, but I get Steinbeck's point. The idea that this is going to transform even ideas about gender and family in ways that I think we maybe don't even recognize because the car has been so deeply written into our lives. In the early 1920s, a farm woman was asked by a social scientist why her family had a Model T Ford but not indoor plumbing, and she replied, "You can't go to town in a bathtub." So again, indicating this sort of like strength of a consumer good that quote unquote isn't necessary is something that this woman is saying, well, actually, it's more necessary than running water. If you can bottle that, that's capitalism right there. And what I mean by that is the sort of idea of unleashing a desire that is almost irrational or is irrational. Why would you need a car over indoor plumbing? Well, you can't go to town and have a fun night in a bathtub. That's a genius woman there, hitting on something I think really vital. Henry Ford was born July 30th, 1863, less than a month after the Battle of Gettysburg, right at the height of the Civil War. He's born in Dearborn, Michigan. At the age of 16, he leaves home to work at machine shops in Detroit after spending his childhood as a sort of mechanical tinkerer, someone who had one of those kids that had a kind of inborn talent for putting things together and taking them apart. By 1893, at the age of 30, Henry Ford is the chief engineer for Detroit's Edison Electric Engineering Company, but he's one of these guys that has ambitions and dreams of doing other things. He spends his nights in the garage. This is sort of like the infamous entrepreneurial garage in American history. It's where Jeff Bezos invented Amazon. It's where Steve Jobs and Wozniak created Apple computers in a garage. All of this might be like mythology, apocryphal stories, etc., but they're important because they indicate that as long as you got a little space and as long as you got the will, you might be able to tinker around on your off hours and create something that revolutionizes the world and makes you a very, very, very rich man. That's the American dream. And Ford is kind of emblematic, obviously, maybe in more ways than any other figure of that dream. So Ford what's he doing? He's building cars in his garage. He's like playing around with local races. He's into the idea of creating a car that's fast and that can beat others and win money in races so that he can create companies. This is interesting because he's this is sort of at the turn of the century. There are more than 60 American car companies. That's 60 American car companies in the year 1900. Most of them were tiny little experiments of men that went bankrupt doing it. But there are a lot of names that you probably never heard of, like the Maxwell, the Thomas, the Holzman, and even one called the Babcock Electric Carriage Company of Buffalo, New York, which made electric cars more than 100 years before Tesla did. And they were selling them, and they were quite successful. But all of these companies, they had their limits, and they were really they're waiting. They're not waiting, but we know in hindsight they're waiting for the moment when cars sort of leap out of the realm of the wealthy hobbyist who's just like some dude that has money and likes to tinker around with cars to like an item that everybody wants and everybody is able to get. And that's going to be Ford's contribution to the story here. Ford starts and ends a number of unsuccessful companies before finally forming the Ford Motor Company June 16th, 1903, and begins producing little cars. Within 10 months, Ford sold 658 of those cars, making $100,000 in profit. That would be the equivalent of opening up a business and 10 months later making $4 million in today's money. In January of 1904, Ford sets the world speed record at 91.37 miles per hour on the frozen ice of Lake St. Clair, proving that he was making reliably fast vehicles. The crucial ingredient for Ford here is having a product that is going to be popular, but the other part of it is the business end of it, the financial end of it, the administrative end of it. That's an area that Ford is not so talented in, and that's why he brings in a young bookkeeper named James Couzens. That's Couzens. Couzens is sort of Ford's secret weapon. He's the guy that's gonna use his talents in finance and administration to apply them to Ford's business model and make something much bigger than Ford would be able to make on his own. So what Ford and Couzens get into is they are determined to make what eventually is going to be called the Model T, the people's car. But they face huge resistance from their investors, the other people that are investing and owning the company with them. And this is a key part of capitalism, right? The corporation has to sort of get together a group of investors that are willing to go along with the plan of the company. But Ford wants to take the company in a direction that these guys don't want to go. They think it's too risky. They don't want to try to make a people's car. They think they'll waste their money doing it. So Ford and Couzens have to take over the company from their investors. And the way they orchestrate that is through a whole lot of financial trickery. Most of their activities would put them in prison today. But in the early 20th century, this is the sort of transition age between the kind of Gilded Age and the Progressive era. There's corruption in capitalism is sort of the hallmark of the whole operation, and we're going to actually see the transition into a sort of different kind of regulation and management. Either way, Ford and Couzens use their sort of like robber baron type trickery to consolidate their power over the Ford Motor Company. And by 1906, they have gained total control of the Ford Motor Company, and Ford can finally make his Model T. He comments in 1906 in a local publication, quote, "The greatest need today is for a light, low-priced car with an up-to-date engine, with ample horsepower, powerful enough for American roads, and capable of carrying its passengers anywhere that a horse-drawn vehicle will go." So Ford and his team begin work on the Model T. Eventually, they have one produced by 1908. And in September of 1908, Ford personally drives the Model T 1,357 miles around Lake Michigan. They make the trip over difficult, steep, muddy terrain, and the car is ready for market because it's proven what Ford wanted it to do, which is being able to go anywhere a horse could go, or a horse-drawn carriage. The Model T, when it's released, has a top speed of 40 miles per hour and gets 20 miles to the gallon, which is actually pretty good considering what a Ford truck today would get in terms of miles to gallon. Another key part of this is that the Ford Model T has interchangeable parts, which allows people to easily and cheaply fix the car and maintain the car rather than having one small thing break and the car being worthless. Interchangeable parts and the ability to go to any hardware store and get stuff that can replace a broken part on your car is absolutely imperative. It's another development of the Model T that makes it so popular. It's not a perfect car by far, and it doesn't improve much, and that's going to be a problem for Ford as more cars and other companies begin to enter the market in the 1920s. It has a difficult and dangerous hand crank that you have to start the car by getting out of the car and starting it with the hand crank on the outside of it. The carburetor draws gas in by gravity, which means that if you are low on gas and you have to go up a hill, you have to go up backwards. Either way, people are willing to manage all of that stuff because the car is so liberating. In May of 1909, just 6 months after releasing them, Ford is forced to stop accepting orders for the Model T because the backlog is too big. And in June 1909, the Ford Model T successfully completes a cross-country drive, which is pretty crazy to think about when you think about the railroads just a few decades earlier completing their east-west passage and making this big announcement that, we can go across the country on a railroad. It's not that much further into the future that Ford and his Model T are saying you can just, anyone can do that. You don't have to get on a train. You can just get in a car that you buy for, maybe $500, and you personally can drive across the country. To me, that vision of you personally driving from ocean to ocean, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, is such an important part of the romantic part of this, the desire part of this, the part of this that really taps into what people need and want in their lives. There's something so liberating and sexy about the idea of getting in a car by yourself, or perhaps with a couple other people, or maybe just one other special person. I'm thinking of Thelma and Louise in my mind right now. But either way, that's Jack Kerouac on the road. That is a bedrock impulse. And that happens in June of 1909. And I mark that in this larger story of the control of the continent, manifest destiny, that other stuff I've mentioned. The Ford Model T successfully completing a cross-country drive in June 1909 sets the standard for what people are going to want from America for the next 100 years or more. So that's an important moment. Obviously, another important thing we're talking about here is mass production. The idea that Ford figures out a way to crank these machines out in the way that other items are being cranked out, specifically clothing and the slaughterhouses of Chicago, which become a sort of model for how to create a moving assembly line. So the moving assembly line is developed for the Ford Model T and begins operation on October 7th, 1913, and continues to evolve after that. You can place the assembly line within the larger bucket of something we call Taylorism. Eventually it's going to be called Fordism. They're not exactly the same things, but they both refer to the idea of scientifically managing production, doing so in a way that maximizes your efficiency and your profits. The assembly line is driven by conveyor belts, and reduces production time for Model Ts to just 93 minutes. So every 90 minutes, a Model T is coming off the end of the line. And what that means is that Ford is able to produce cars faster and more efficiently than anyone else, and it's going to lead to his total dominance. Obviously, once everyone else copies the assembly line, that will change. But Ford says in 1922 that I believe this was the first moving line ever installed. The idea came in a general way from the overhead trolley that the Chicago packers use in dressing beef. So that's Henry Ford sort of taking credit for the assembly line. And I think most people in America, at least the ones that know anything about Henry Ford, they might know, he invented the assembly line. He did not invent the assembly line. He simply sort of consolidated it into the production of cars. Here's a quote from Charles Sorensen, who wrote a memoir in 1956 called My 40 Years with Ford, in which he detailed what it was like to work inside these factories. And what he says is the following. What was worked out at Ford was the practice of moving the work from one worker to another until it became a complete unit, then arranging the flow of these units at the right time and the right place to a moving final assembly line from which came a finished product. Regardless of earlier uses of some of these principles, the direct line of succession of mass production and its intensification into automation stems directly from what we worked out at Ford Motor Company between 1908 and 1913. Henry Ford is generally regarded as the father of mass production. He was not. He was the sponsor of it. So regardless of where we're putting the authorship of the assembly line here, on the workers themselves or of Henry Ford and the bosses for sort of pushing the idea, we get the result is mass production. Ford's cars are now coming off the line in 3-minute intervals. The pieces are being created faster than ever before. while using less manpower. And one important part of this is that stuff was moving so fast that the only paint that could dry on the assembly line while the cars moved through them is black. So Ford was famous for saying, you can get a Model T any car in any color you want as long as it's black. Black is what the Model T is going to look like, and that's that. Again, the sort of like idea that the Model T is sort of made one way and that's it is going to be the death knell of the Model T ultimately. But right now, the strength of Ford is being able to create a dependable car very quickly. On January 5th, 1914, James Couzens announced a $5 a day policy. The policy of paying workers $5 a day sent shockwaves through the American and European press and drove European migration. Nearly a century later, older citizens of Detroit are going to tell how their grandparents left Europe to come to Detroit because they were lured by the $5 a day job at the Ford Motor Company. And other companies are going to be forced to match this. Obviously it sounds ludicrous today of $5 a day, but at the time this was mind-blowing to people. And the idea that Detroit would be a subject of European people who are thinking about moving to, migrating to the United States, that Detroit is sort of like the Silicon Valley of this moment, the place where innovation is happening, the place where capitalism is settling into a new moment, and it feels like this is where we want to be. So Detroit is going to be a central sort of spot for European immigration, specifically from Eastern Europe. A lot of Jewish people. This is going to come back to Ford Motor Company and be part of this history as well, because this is happening during the Progressive Era. And what I mean by that is, the Progressive Era is a massive part of understanding American history, and it's one that I think is complicated. I feel like you see a lot of conspiracy videos on YouTube about the Progressive Era. And I think that's in part, part of it has to do with vaccines, obviously. But what the Progressive Era is a moment in which there is a sort of widespread embrace of scientific rationalism among people with money and power that want to apply scientific principles to create society. And that's it's sort of associated with middle-class reform movements. I think this is part of why the progressive movement is hard for people to understand, is because it's a complicated set of phenomenon. It's a moment in which that goes in a lot of different directions, and the idea of using scientific principles to manage the society in a rational way leads nations down roads that go all sorts of different directions, including into things like eugenics and even the Nazi project. Can be seen as somehow extensions or part of the world that the Progressive Era makes. So the Progressive Era is like a whole other podcast. But what I want to think about now is sort of where Ford falls in that. Henry Ford is definitely falls into the idea of like a progressive, rational business leader of the early progressive, or the 20th century, the Progressive Era. He's someone who fits right in there. He's someone who is applying these principles of scientific rationalism. Well, progressives also have ideas about immigration and about primitive peoples, about civilization that would make many of us very uncomfortable today, right? I think they'd also make many of us comfortable, honestly, considering how many people hate immigrants in the United States and otherwise. But either way, during the Progressive Era, it is a common thought that immigrants need to be Americanized, right? And this process is happening in direct ways through teaching the English language only in schools, but also like through in a kind of cultural process, like through movies. I think that's the primary way this is happening. Honestly, is like pop culture is going to flatten and sort of distort and erase a lot of other cultures as we are heading towards a kind of American melting pot culture. At least that's the ideology, that's the thought. And that melting pot idea is very popular during the progressive era, not to show like how, oh, we're so diverse, but more to show like the melting pot is where you get rid of, you shed all of the other elements of foreign cultures and you embrace Americanism. So this took place at the Ford Motor Company as immigrants began pouring into Detroit and filling up the factories. Ford began English language schools that were part of being an employee at Ford Motor Company. Graduates of the Ford English Language School would participate in the pageant of the Ford Melting Pot, in which workers would arrive wearing their traditional clothes from their homeland and would exit the papier-mâché melting pot wearing a business suit, a straw hat, and waving an American flag. So this is like, get rid of all your donkey culture from the East, from Eastern Europe. We're fucking Americans here. And that's what that melting pot ceremony was meant to mean. We're going to go into some areas that are pretty nasty here thinking about Ford. And this is just one of them, but I want to emphasize that, you know, at this point, it's not like there would have been great outrage about this. Americanism and shedding the primitive culture of your homeland is an encouraged, active part of American cultural and social and political life during this era. Ford sells 300,000 Model Ts in 1914, more than 4 times of just 3 years earlier, and within 2 years, sales of the Model T will more than double again to 700,000 a year. There is a sort of, again, biblical association with Ford Motor Company at this point. Ford is seen as a figure that has come down from on high and delivered this amazing miracle object to the people. There's a Ford joke book that comes out in 1915 that includes the 23rd Ford Psalm, which goes like this: "The Ford is my auto, I shall not want another. It maketh me lie down beneath it. It anointeth my clothes with oil. It soareth my soul. Yea, though I ride through the valleys, I am towed up the hills. I fear much evil, for its rods and its engines discomfort me. I anoint its tires and patches. Its radiator runneth over. I repair its blowouts in the presence of mine enemies. Surely if this thing followed me all the days of my life, I shall dwell in the bug house forever." So you can tell by 1915, the Ford Model T has become a recognized part of American popular culture. It's got, at this point, I think that Ford has released powers into the American public that are going to be beyond the control of anybody, really. And the automakers are going to be trying to figure out this power all the way until the moment I'm sitting here recording this podcast right now. They're still trying to figure it out. What do people want, right? And by 1915, it's clear that consumer culture, pop culture, is a force that is very, very potent, and you have a whole industry that's being created around advertising and marketing to try to figure out what it is that people want. All this is going to lead, honestly, to like algorithms trying to figure out what people want, right? Either way, by 1915, Ford is sitting at the top of a company that has unleashed this power, right? And it's going to sort of, he's going to enter into a pattern that I think is going to be common among this ultra-capitalist class, and that is that Ford evolves into a megalomaniac, an eccentric and destructive personality who is a narcissist, obsessed with his own power and wealth, and really begins to think in ways that are sort of universal in sort of like his power. He's like, kind of like, what can I do with it? And it's going to lead to a lot of weird and uncomfortable moments, and arguably the end of the Model T as the central car of American life. So what happens is in 1915, Henry Ford begins to branch out into current events and comment on politics. In 1915, he creates a project. He's part of a project called the Peace Ship, which is going over to Europe to help mediate World War I or the beginnings of World War I. This is the moment where German U-boats are firing upon passenger ships, and there's a lot of thought that Europe is falling into ultranationalism and militarism. Well, Henry Ford thinks that, hell, I can probably solve that if I get on a ship with a bunch of other rich guys and go over to Europe and just talk to them. Well, that ends up being a miserable failure and international embarrassment in which Henry Ford, much, honestly like Elon Musk, makes himself look like an ignorant and incompetent asshole that has no power whatsoever, no juice, that is actually sort of bullshitting a lot of people. And this peace ship was an early example of something that's going to get even worse as time goes on. In 1918, Henry Ford decides, I could run for senator. I'm going to be a U.S. senator from Michigan. He runs for Senate. His campaign is horrible. He switches parties several times. I'm a Republican. No, I'm a Democrat now. No, I'm a Republican again. He puts no money or effort into the campaign at all, loses the election, and whines that the election was stolen. He uses Ford Motor Company's money to fund several private investigations into the so-called fake election. These investigations go nowhere, and Ford investors are getting nervous. They're thinking, this guy is losing his mind, his megalomania, his disbelief that the American people would not vote for him is leading us into some destructive paths. This is only going to get worse. After his humiliating loss in his Senate run in 1918, Henry Ford turns from politics to publishing. He purchases several newspapers, including the Dearborn Independent, and he turns it into an anti-Semitic conspiracy newspaper, which basically has article after article saying that the Jews are starting World War I so that the Gentiles will all kill each other. This enters into a 7-year hate campaign in which Henry Ford is publicly obsessed with hating Jews and spreading conspiracy theories about how Jews run the world. In Germany, Ford's book, which is called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem, is published by Theodor Frisch, who's the founder of several anti-Semitic parties, a Nazi, in other words. In a letter written in 1924, Heinrich Himmler described Ford as, quote, one of our most valuable, important, and witty fighters. Henry Ford is the only American mentioned favorably in Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. Adolf Hitler wrote, quote, only a single great man, Henry Ford, who to the Jews' fury still maintains full independence from the controlling masters of the producers in a nation of 120 million. In 1931, Hitler was talking to a Detroit News reporter and said, quote, I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration, explaining his reason for keeping a life-size portrait of Henry Ford behind his desk. Historian Stephen Watts wrote that Hitler revered Ford, proclaiming that I shall do my best to put his theories into practice in Germany, and modeling the Volkswagen Beetle, the people's car, on the Model T. A Nazi and Hitler youth leader, Baldur von Schirach, testified at Nuremberg, quote, the decisive anti-Semitic book I was reading and the book that influenced my comrades was the book by Henry Ford, The International Jew. I read it and became anti-Semitic. The book made a great influence on myself and my friends because we saw in Henry Ford the representative of success and also the representative of a progressive social policy. Love that little hint of the kind of connection between success and progressive social policy and Nazism. Ford ultimately issues an apology about his anti-Semitism in 1927 when sales are damaged from protests and other demonstrations about this anti-Semitism. Many people accept Ford's change of heart, but others see it as too little, too late, especially as dark forces are gathering in Europe. Henry Ford's connection to Nazism is obviously a huge stain on the history of the Ford Motor Company and something that's actually addressed in their corporate material on their website. It's a part of the history, and it's one you can't get around. I mean, I think I can just say Henry Ford was a fucking Nazi. And that part of the history is something that we should think a lot about, particularly when we think about not just Henry Ford as being like this bad guy that hates Jews and is kind of a Nazi. It's more, to me, the important part of it is, why did the Nazis love Henry Ford so much? Not just because he hated Jews. They were into the way that he connected ideas about nativism and Americanism into a forceful, nationalistic, social capitalist policy. They were amazed by how Ford was sort of using capitalism as a machine, literally, of washing out uncomfortable, ugly elements of culture they didn't like and create the type of like Ubermensches that these people get off thinking about. In other words, they saw capitalism the same way Henry Ford did, as a machine for creating the sort of Nazi society that they wanted to create. So that part of it is really, really important because the sort of social engineering element of capitalism is something worth thinking about, that the social engineering is happening through the products, that the products themselves, the cars, are part of the social engineering, and that part of it is connected to basically men who had the ugliest ideas of the 20th century. And I think that as we head into the 21st century, thinking about the men who control these companies, it's worth thinking, about the men, but also about the projects themselves and what they represent and how they play with ideas of desire that sometimes go into darker areas than most of us are willing to recognize when we're thinking about cars. Okay, so Robert Lacey, a historian who wrote a biography of Ford called Ford, the Men and the Machines, he wrote and alleged that when Henry Ford saw newsreel footage of the Nazi concentration camps and the actual visual evidence of the extermination of millions of people, the same footage that I was shown in high school and college in documentaries, that shocking footage of piles of corpses being pushed around by tractors, what Robert Lacey alleges is that Ford had a stroke after he watched that newsreel footage, and that was his final stroke in 1947, and he died at the age of 83. So that's a pretty intense, like, Citizen Kane fucking moment to think about Henry Ford sitting in his chair with a blanket over him, the old man, this man who created American capitalism in the 20th century, or at least a significant chunk of it, watching some sort of outcome, some sort of connection to that being the extermination of millions of Jews in Europe. Having a stroke after watching that, God, that is as Hollywood as it gets, and that can maybe give us a little direction in terms of where we're going here. Hollywood and the kind of movement of cars from a farmer car to a kind of a car that a celebrity would drive. So in the 1920s, that's when a lot of this culture is changing. In addition to being, the era of World War I, we're going back to the 1920s, by the way, now. Sorry, I was in 1947 just now, dying with Henry Ford, watching the Holocaust footage. But now let's turn the time machine back to the early 1920s and think about what's happening during that era. It's the progressive era, but also culturally, we think of the 1920s as, the Roaring '20s, the Jazz Age. Obviously, these are things that sort of act as stand-ins for phenomena that are a lot more complicated than just like Leo dancing around in a nice house in Long Island in the Great Gatsby. But the 1920s are sort of a moment where mass culture, pop culture, consumerism are visible in American life in really profound ways. So, there is this sort of like, things get nicer in the 20s, especially for middle-class people who are able to afford cool clothes and cars and radios and air conditioners and refrigerators and all the sorts of awesome things that American industrial capitalism is starting to produce and make available for ordinary people. So this kind of jazz moment is a big moment, obviously. It's going to crash miserably into the Great Depression and World War II, obviously. But for now, nobody knows that yet. It's the 20s and we're all having a good time, right? Prohibition is happening. You can go back to some of our Nostalgia Trap episodes about that era and why that's important. But, you know, the main point is that the farmer's car of the Model T is becoming obsolete within that culture. It's old-fashioned, and people are wanting something a little bit more luxurious, something a little cooler. I'm sure there's some, like, jazz age slang term for cool that I'm missing. But either way, people in the 20s and consumers in the 20s are kind of over the Model T. Henry Ford, refuses to change, refuses to even fix the car so it doesn't have a hand crank on it anymore. At one point, engineers create a new car while Ford is on vacation in Europe. They create a new model and they say, this is a cool car, the kids will love it, we should change. And Ford tore that car apart with his bare hands. He was resistant to change. He was like, fuck you all. The Model T is the most popular car and object ever made. We're not changing it. And that, you know, he may have been right. He may have been wrong. Either way, it made it look like he wasn't willing to evolve along with the times. In 1926, Ford's market share had dropped below 50%, meaning they no longer have even half of the people that are buying cars buying Fords. And General Motors and its brand, specifically Chevrolet, are on the rise. Now, General Motors and Chevrolet and this other company are going to become, obviously, a massive part of our story here. But for now, General Motors is kind of like the up-and-comers, right? They're trying to figure out how to beat Ford. And one way they're going to do that is through something called planned obsolescence. General Motors and specifically Chevrolet are going to lead the way on this phenomenon. I'm sure if you're listening to Nostalgia Trap, you've probably come across the term planned obsolescence before. You may have even seen it, a documentary about it, or read a book about it, or whatever. So I won't go into too much detail. I know you probably know what it means, but the basic idea is that we don't make the same thing every year. We make different products every year so that people will actually throw out a perfectly good product just to buy the new one this year. And we can achieve this all sorts of ways, through styling, like the new style, but also just like putting new features on the car every year. So in other words, the point is every year you get a new car that makes your car that was perfectly good last year and actually is perfectly good now. Now you feel like that car is worthless shit and you want the new car because it's got a cool new whatever on it. That's planned obsolescence. It's a horror and a nightmare, and it's honestly, in many ways, you could say that development of planned obsolescence, the idea that we're going to keep our business alive year to year by essentially making bullshit products that are going to break in a year, so you got to buy a new one, or we're going to trick you through marketing into thinking that you need a new one when you don't. That fucked the world, probably more than any other satanic idea that capitalism has developed. The idea that we're just going to make shit we don't need and you don't need forever just so a few guys on the planet can get really, really rich forever, that seems pretty bad. That seems like something future generations are going to look at and maybe laugh about if they're not, living on a distant planet somewhere because this one has been ruined. All right, I'm off my rant, but you get the point. So planned obsolescence comes into the scene in the 1920s along with the whole advertising industry, etc. And that's going to really, in a lot of ways, run Ford's Model T into the ground. On May 25th, 1927, 5 days after Charles Lindbergh completed his flight around the world, Ford announced that it would discontinue the Model T. Sort of the end of an era. There were a lot of obituaries written about it, including one in the Bismarck Tribune in North Dakota, which said, quote, "For years, the homely flivver sold as fast as Ford could make them. Then about 3 years ago, there came a change. Slowly at first, Then more rapidly, people passed up the flivver for more ornamental machines. So people want something cooler, something that looks awesome in the 1920s, and that's going to change the auto industry and make the Model T go away. So the Model T, there's a lot of important elements of understanding why it was so popular and then why it was unpopular. But I think the main hits are, for us and for our purposes, are one, Henry Ford turned into a psycho Nazi and made it look like the company was run by someone who was more concerned with throwing dirt at Jews in public and running around with Hitler and his friends than running a successful business. But the other part of it is that the Model T was a victim of its times. It had done its job. It had given millions and millions of farmers the ability to go to town and do something different than just sit on their farm their whole lives. And once that had been achieved, Ford's plan wasn't much beyond that. He didn't really have the vision to turn the company into something that was going to be successful in the new market that's going to be created by companies like General Motors. So we enter into the story a new figure, a man named Harley Earl. Harley Earl is an instrumental figure in the development of the history of the automobile in the 20th century, and he's someone that I don't think a lot of Americans know his name or much about him. But even if you don't know Harley, Harley knows you, and I think that's going to be the key to his success. Harley Earl is born in 1893. He is the total opposite of Henry Ford, not from a little rural area outside of Detroit, Michigan, raised as a farm boy, but instead, Harley Earl is raised in a 3-story mansion in Hollywood, California. His neighbors are celebrities, including the director Cecil B. DeMille. Earl is a big, strapping, strong, athletic dude instead of like the frail little farm guy that Henry Ford is. Harley Earl is cosmopolitan. He's athletic. He's 6'4", handsome, tan, playing football, rugby, track, baseball. He's like this big manly dude. But he also has a talent for art and has a sort of fashion and flamboyance about him. Harley's father owns an automobile design shop which basically makes custom designed vehicles for celebrities. And by the time he's 16 years old, Harley Earl is working at his dad's shop and is the most popular guy at the shop because he's shown an inborn talent for design. I think that's really interesting to think that at 16 years old, Henry Ford is showing that he's really good at building vehicles that function well. He's just a really great mechanic. But at the age of 16, Harley Earl is showing similar talents, but not for the mechanical end of the car, but for the look of the car, the design of the car. He's able to make these really cool looking vehicles, and the business is successful, and ultimately Harley Earl gains attention for his designs. In 1926, at the age of 32, Harley Earl heads to Detroit to basically enter like an audition, a 3-month job, helping design Cadillacs for General Motors. This is the entryway into celebrity for him because his designs are so much better than everyone else's that the leaders of General Motors, including Alfred Sloan, who is the head of General Motors since 1923, they look at Harley Earl's designs and they're like, holy shit, this is the future of automaking. This is our guy. It blew them away and they want his designs badly. It's basically what they have been looking for. Alfred Sloan is a key figure in developing the whole idea of planned obsolescence. Again, he took over as head of General Motors in 1923. His strategy was, I can't beat Ford at his own game of constantly cutting costs and making faster and faster production. Instead, General Motors will change the game, and rather than producing a one-size-fits-all car like the Model T, here you go, that's all you get, General Motors is going to create a hierarchy of brands. The buyer can start by buying a cheap Chevrolet, graduate to getting a Pontiac, an Oldsmobile, a Buick, and if you really make it to the top of the wealth ladder in America, you can buy a Cadillac. So the idea that the sort of car's quality and style would increase alongside a person's social mobility is a totally genius idea, because what it does is it like sort of acts as a model for the quote unquote American dream, right? You know your social status, you know your class, you know how well you're doing based on the kind of car you're driving. So that sort of idea that we have all these brands and you kind of pick the one that matches you, but it's all owned by General Motors, is the genius stroke of Alfred Sloan. And what Henry Ford did for mass manufacturing of cars, Alfred Sloan does for mass marketing of cars. So Henry Ford is he sold all those cars in part because Ford had no competition and he made a great product and there was nowhere else you could get it. But as soon as there was competition, Ford Model T is done. And Alfred Sloan and Harley Earl are going to enter into a period where they're producing very, very popular cars that are going to capture the public imagination and go much beyond just the notion of practical transportation into the realm of dreams, into the realm that I really want to get at in this podcast, which is the corporate control of dream life. In 1927, General Motors introduces the LaSalle, a youthful, sporty, and elegant roadster. You should see this thing. The 1927 LaSalle is a beautiful vehicle. It contrasts with the Model T dramatically in terms of its curves, in terms of its lines. You know, there are aesthetic properties to the LaSalle that the Model T just doesn't have. This car becomes especially popular with the small but growing numbers of woman drivers on the road. And this is so key, right? If we're thinking about desire, if we're thinking about the corporations as sort of libidinal magicians, erotic magicians, people and companies that have unleashed powers that are sort of driving the country in more ways than one, gender is a key element in that. And when I say gender, I don't just mean women. When I say gender, I mean sort of all of those relationships, all of those ideas of what masculinity is, and how people relate to one another and how that fits into what we call capitalism. That's gender, and that's what the LaSalle, that is released in 1927, is going to tap into. This sort of like idea of youth and femininity, and style that is going to be an important element in the auto industry moving forward. The LaSalle is a graceful car with a great deal of charm for the female eye on account of its smart lines. That's one of the advertising features on the LaSalle. An actress named Clara Bow, who you may or may not know, Clara Bow was a huge star in the silent era. She's photographed throughout Los Angeles in 1927 and 28, driving her LaSalle Roadster. This is like early paparazzi shit. She's got the car, and that just makes it even more sexy. The fact that Clara Bow drives around LA in one of these. The LaSalle obeys the feminine hand instantly with only the slightest effort. In the first year, 1927, 1928, General Motors sold 27,000 LaSalles, and a new era in car making and American consumerism is born. But just to give you a hint of where we're going, the Great Depression is coming. World War II is coming. And there's going to be a break. There's going to be a sort of pause in automaking. But for now, Harley Earl has broken open the whole world. And Harley Earl becomes the secret weapon of General Motors. He begins a rise to executive leadership of General Motors. And really, the LaSalle marks the beginning of an unbelievable career that will utterly transform American culture. And just like all of the sort of biblical and mythological analogies that were thrown on Henry Ford, you have the people of General Motors gathering around Harley Earl as if he is a cult figure who has unleashed a power that they know is going to launch them into the future. And there is a big painting of letters, stenciled letters, inside the General Motors factory. And those letters say, "Our Father, who art in styling, Harley be thy name." Well, all right, folks, that is the conclusion of part 1 of the history of America in 6 cars. I hope you enjoyed that. If you've got thoughts about the Model T, Ford as a Nazi, electric cars, etc., please share them in the comments on the Patreon page where you can find the rest of these episodes. I'll be putting them out over the course of the next few weeks. Very excited to share the history of the automobile and the history of American capitalism with you. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.